yesterday that componentWillReceiveProps is deprecated, and they don't recommend using it anymore. And that's what we used to get the note ID out of the URL every time the props change, because when we know when the URL changes, the props will definitely change, because that's how we get the URL and the params. So componentWillReceiveProps is deprecated, and they recommend you use componentWillUpdate or componentDidUpdate instead. So I'm going to rewrite this same thing using componentDidUpdate, which is a little different and requires us to do it a bit differently. So let's try to make that change. So I'll leave this here, componentDidUpdate. So the difference is partially when it runs. So willReceiveProps runs before it actually happens. DidUpdate runs after it happens, but there's also componentWillUpdate. But after it happens is fine. Here we get the new props as an argument, and the old props are still our actual props, right? So this .props still points to what it used to be. In the case of componentDidUpdate, it's already happened, so we actually receive the old props in the old state as arguments, but we don't need to actually use them, so I'm not going to put them in the list, but they are being passed in. So you can still compare the old props to the new if you needed to, but we don't necessarily need to do that. So let's see, get the ID from the URL. We still need to do that. In this case, the props have already been set, so that will just be this .props, .match, .params, .id, and we can still put the safety check there. And we only want to go further if the ID has changed. So componentDidUpdate will run not only when the props change, but also when state changes. So if we just set state over and over, it's going to run this over and over, and we're going to have an infinite loop. And we'll still run into that, but I'm going to go ahead and check to see that the new ID is not the same as the old ID before I even bother. So let's get the previous ID too. So get the previous ID from state. So the new ID comes from the URL. The previous ID comes from state. So I'll say const old ID equals this .state.note.id, again, or empty string. And then I only want to move on if they're different from each other. So continue only if they're different. So if new ID not equal old ID to string. Coming out of the URL, it's always going to be a string. But this one coming from state will probably be a number if it's not empty string. So I'll still call it a string here. So if that's the case, then we'll want to do this. We'll want to find the note with that ID. So we'll still do something very much like these two lines. Except now it's not new props, it's this .props. These are our actual props. By the time it runs componentDidUpdate, it's already happened. The props have changed. And then having, so inside here, what did we just do? Find the note with the new ID. And then once we've done that, update state with that note. If we do this now, maximum depth exceeded, we got an infinite loop. Now, thankfully, React saves us from the infinite loop, so it doesn't actually bring our computer to its knees and eat up all the CPU. It kills it once it does it enough times. So the issue is we're calling this .setState over and over, even though I put this check in here. So here's why. When I first load the page and I've got an ID in the URL. We get that. It's whatever that number is. From state, well, there was nothing already in the state. We just loaded the page. So they're different, so we're going to run this. And, okay, we grab the note. We say set state. That fires this again, but when we set it to this.prop, when we search through this.props.notes, this is happening almost as soon as the page loads. We haven't necessarily finished loading the array from Firebase yet. It happens too fast for that. So it's going to go ahead and it's just going to get blank note, and it's going to set state, which is going to trigger componentDidUpdate again. And the state still doesn't have the new ID because it was blank note. So this is still going to be true, and it's going to do it again, and on and on and on, because Firebase hasn't given us the results yet. So we could go to some trouble to make sure that Firebase is finished loading. There's a way to do that, but instead, we'll just do this. We'll check if node ID is not equal to this.state.node ID. So if we're in the scenario that I just described, node ID will be null because it'll be a blank note. And this.state.node ID will also be null, so it won't call set state over and over again with a blank note. It'll only do it once. So if there's nothing to change by setting state, we won't change state. So yeah, we're kind of doing this check twice. We wouldn't maybe have to do it the first time, but we also don't need to bother to do this work if the ID hasn't changed. So now it works, no infinite loop. And we've changed componentDidUpdate from componentWillReceiveProps. Now we have both in here, so let's get rid of componentWillReceiveProps. Yeah.
There's another way of doing this where the way I did it was like use a getDerivedStateByProps, which is a static function, and then it's basically the same code that you had originally, except you return the node object and you make blank node of the static function. It works the same way.
Okay. Tell me the name of that again. I've heard of that, but what is it again? Get derived state from props, yeah. Get derived state from props. So get derived state from props invoked right before calling the render method, both on the initial mount and on subsequent updates. So it will run when the props change. It should return an object to update the state or null to update nothing. So you just return the object that should update state. So you would return the node object like you were saying. Yeah, otherwise it's very similar to the code that we had when we used componentWillReceiveProps because the props are passed in as an argument there. Okay, yeah, cool. You could do it that way too. So use componentDidUpdate rather than componentWillReceiveProps. Questions about that?